taking our player IDs, we now want to allow us to essentially click on any character that we like, and then we're going to take that ID and essentially put it in the URL, transition to the new page, and then re-render that information about that particular player. So to do this, we can jump up to our template. We're then going to create a nav with a class of links, and then inside, we're going to create a few A tags. We then want to dynamically bind each href to the player's ID, and then essentially put the name in the middle. So we're going to have something that looks like this, where we have the player name, and then the href is then going to be the player ID, and we can also add that slash at the beginning. So to do this dynamically and allow us to access each individual player, we can interpolate again. So here we're going to say $ and then curly brackets, and we can just reference our constant of players. So we can say players.map. This then gives us each individual player, and inside our map function, we can return essentially a new string and then close off our interpolation with a curly brace. Now at the moment, if we save this out, this is in fact going to error because the constant is not available. You can see we have cannot read property map of undefined. And I've deliberately chosen to use map here because a for each doesn't actually return us the template piece of an href. So if you want to jump up and paste in the players above, you can hit save, and you can see that we now have some very nicely styled links. Now the interesting thing is we can start clicking them. If you watch the URL, we can see that we are now navigating between every single URL. Now at this point, we may think that we are fully done. However, I don't know if you can see, but there's a flicker every single time that we click this. And that is because we are not actually using the history API. We are supplying some hyperlinks. So if we actually look, we have href equals and then the link itself. So anytime we're clicking these, it's actually doing a full page refresh, even though it is changing the URL. So how might we overcome this? We can create a constant, which is going to refer to our links. We can then say document, query selector. Now we want to use query selector all because we're going to look at the A tags inside of our links class. Now before we close this off, I'm going to add this inside an array, and then we're going to use ... to use the spread operator and spread those nodes, because query selector all returns us a node list, which means that it doesn't have array methods such as map, filter, reduce, and so forth. So if we wanted to get a bit more clever, we could of course use a for of loop, but I like to use the for each method with this. Now in later browsers, query selector all does actually support for each. However, this is just a good practice I like to use, is to convert those node lists over to an array. And because a node list, such as query selector all, is a static collection, it doesn't change if new links are dynamically added, for example. This is just a personal preference of mine. So let's go ahead and say links.forEach. We can take each individual link, and inside the function, we can bind an event listener. So if we bind a click event, we can talk to that particular object. Now, because we are currently dealing with a full page refresh, if we click, you can see it takes a moment and then gives us a flicker. What we essentially want to do to prevent that is, in fact, the clue is in the name, prevent the default. So if we prevent the default action, hit save, we're not actually going to see anything happen. So we can click, click, click. Nothing is changing in the URL. So at this point, we've essentially hijacked the page with JavaScript, and we want to now, using the history API, change the URL. We know how to do this already using replace states. However, we're going to use our push state. Now, the reason that I have tied these IDs into the URL, and this is quite a common practice that we would adopt, is having that unique ID somewhere on the page. It could be the URL. The router is a nice place for us to keep this as a single source of truth. It means that if we refresh, we can then read the URL or the root params, pass it off to our server, go and get the data, and so forth. So what we are essentially going to do, because we no longer have any control over setting the URL, we need to actually get the link that was clicked and read this href attribute. So what we want to end up with is an ID, and that is simply the ID of that particular player. We can say event.target. Now we could use href, however, this returns us the entire URL. So this will return localhost in there as well. So what we can use instead is get attribute, which will actually allow us to read just the contents of the attribute rather than the href property, which then includes the full URL. Now, if we log out our ID, I'll open up the DevTools console. We can click on one of these and you can see that that is working nicely. However, we have this / at the beginning, so we don't really want that. Now to remove this, I'm going to use a substring and then pass in a number 1. This will then just remove it. We can then start clicking and we have those unique IDs all on their own with no / at the beginning. So this tells us which player we have in fact clicked. So now we can, like we did below, let's just refresh our memory. We can say const player. Now here we manually selected the first player in the list with a square bracket 0 call. Whereas in this instance, we're going to find it based on the ID. So we're going to say players find, give me each individual player. And if the player's ID equals, so matches the ID returned to us on the href tag minus the / because of course our player ID doesn't have a /, then we know that that is in fact the player that we've clicked on. So let's just confirm this. We can click on Mario. We see Mario's object, Luigi, Yoshi, and so forth. So at this point, to finish things off, we need to start making some root transitions. So we're going to call history, push state, pass in that particular player. Of course, we leave the title as empty. And then because we have the ID already, we could use the ID or we can use the player's ID that's returned from our player here. Now, after that has happened, we want to then call our render function and pass in that particular player. Now, because this is a loop, what I'm going to do is move this below. I like to keep selectors above, then we have function definitions, and then behavior below, such as links.forEach. So we'll save this out, go back to the browser, we can click Mario, keep an eye on the URL as we change. We have Mario, Italian plumber and lead character, Luigi, Luigi's URL, Yoshi, and Wario. So that's a really nice way that we can bind the unique IDs to each individual A tag. We can read the A tag after we have clicked on that particular item. We then remove the /. We then go and find a particular player. We then set the player in the history stack, which we would then be able to see in our list in our history. And then finally, for UI presentational purposes, we then go and render that particular item. So I hope you enjoyed this video. There's a few more things I want to cover in this chapter. So let's carry on and start exploring this back and forward functionality and look at an event called the pop state.